We begin now with Lecture 2, Theories of Law and Human Rights. We're going to look at morality and ethics and try and place democracy and capitalism in that structure, and then move on down to a seminal case, Citizens United, and see how that fits the definition and the ideas behind morality and ethics. So I'm going to give you a general definition of those things and discuss each to give us some grounding. So when we talk about things being moral, we're relating to the standards of good or bad behavior, fairness, honesty, that each person believes in rather than laws. In other words, these are things that laws should be built upon and not the other way around. Now, there are definitions, and definitions are always problematic. There are definitions here about, how do we go about defining good or bad behavior or fairness or honesty, and on and on and on. And how do we know that each person believes in those things? We spoke last time about the underpinnings and the rationale for some fundamental rights, without which it would make sense for anyone to belong to any particular government structure, and it would create all kinds of havoc in the relationship between people. And one of the fundamental things is the right to survive, because I think we can all agree that no matter how you define good, bad, or all of it, it is critical that whatever we structure it, however we structure it, it embodies that principle of continuance, the right to survive. So we're not going to worry about necessarily defining good or bad or fairness or honesty, because we yet need to develop a basis for those things. Talk about what human rights are, as we've looked at them in the past, or philosophers have, and so on. You have to look at that first. But I want to give you some grounding in when we talk about what is moral. This is where we're trying to go, and you'll see that we will inform those definitions by looking at what philosophers and others have done in the past to come to terms with defining this concept of human rights. Now, ethics is the study of what is morally right and wrong. So you see, ethics depend upon, and there's been some emergence of these ideas, but ethics depends upon getting to this point of determining what's morally right or wrong. And that's not necessarily easy to do either. Or some sort of set of beliefs about what is morally right and wrong. So now you see, we've got government sitting up here, right? Being developed by this concept of moral and ethical behavior. And beneath that, we have the idea of fundamental human rights. So fundamental human rights should be informing what we think is moral and ethical. And that should inform how we structure our governments, which then produce this idea of the rule of law. The rule of law at the top of this should be consistent with both morality, ethics, and the fundamentals of human rights. So we're actually starting in a different place. Last time we went to government and all of that. Now we're dropping down. We're talking about morality and ethics in more depth. And now I specifically want to tie that to this idea of democracy and capitalism and explore whether or not those things are good conduits or vehicles for human rights. Or does it lead to some sort of violation of human rights, and so on and so forth. As an example of this, one of the fundamental human rights that we have in the United States is this idea of freedom of speech. We'll go into that a bit, but I'm not necessarily concerned about exploring that. If you're interested in that, you should take a common law class. But I'm going to look at a specific case which deals with really the conflict between democracy and capitalism, and that's Citizens United. And that case you can find on the internet, you can find in most places, you can find it in every constitutional law textbook. I shouldn't say every, that's absolute, someone might have left it out, although I can't imagine why. So let's talk about this idea then of morality a bit. You have to have the fundamental here is that each person believes in this is good behavior, this is fairness, this is honesty, and that that is more important than laws, because laws are written by folks and legislative bodies and so on, and they could embody many different interpretations. In fact, when you look at Supreme Court cases, because they're the final arbiters, right? they define a lot of these terms, as I mentioned, they define those terms because we need to know what they mean. And what those that wrote the legislation assumed that they meant, and because they build their arguments on them. And you'll see when we get to Citizens United, that's the major problem, of freedom of speech. Okay, so there is already this idea that there's a buy-in about what we all believe. Now, different cultures, past to the present, which are experiences they've all had, have led to sort of different definitions of those things. I mean, if you look at, you go back in history and you look at the legal prerogatives or the prerogatives of, kings and the like, what was fair is they basically were able to structure and, call things. What about dictatorships? Same thing. So this idea of what's fair depends upon what the culture has come to embrace, right? And you'll see that democracy and capitalism informs the culture in the United States. And as such, by informing that culture, we build our institutions upon those things. And the question then becomes, how much do we deviate from those definitions in creating our structure? So there is a cultural influence that takes these terms, fairness and honesty and so on, and a path to a president for every organized people that, I don't want to say distorts them, but defines them differently. And you'll see when we get to exploring fundamental human rights today that that's the very thing that's supposed to be taken out of the equation, right? That those things should not influence what we think of as good or bad, fair and honest, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea of ethics is you're looking at what's morally right and morally wrong. So you're saying, is this good or is it fair? Does that make it right action and so on, or wrong? And beliefs about what's morally right and wrong. So therein lies the major debate, how we define those things. And so that's the major struggle as we try and get our minds around this idea of human rights. That should inform the moral and ethical issues, should address those rather, and help define them if we accept them. And if we don't accept them, then it becomes more problematic in the long run because we have no basis of agreement. You'll see that it's critical that we all get to the point where we can agree that, yes, in fact, human rights do inform our definition of these things, that they're so fundamental that you can't talk about good, bad, honest, fair without addressing the definition of those things. All right, so hold off on that for a second. We come back to it. I want to talk about democracy and capitalism because these are structural elements in a governance, right, that inform what is good, right, wrong, and so on. And the question I want to look at is what happens when the democratic structure paired with a capitalist, economic political structure, does that help make a country more morally consistent and ethical as well? Or are those two ideas fundamentally in conflict and can never produce a moral and ethical society, right? So human rights, when put into the structure of a democratic capitalist society, which is what we think of ourselves here in the United States and in other developed nations, right? When placed into that structure, is that structure consistent with those ideas, those fundamental human rights? Or can they be, by using democratic structures and capitalist structures, can they be so distorted that things like fairness and honesty and good and bad behavior are really not defined? And then to look at how they are basically manipulated. All right, so let me sort of put this in a structure so we can kind of bring it all together. At the core of what we're going to look at should be this idea of what human rights are. That's the major struggle, because that's going to inform what good or bad behavior is, regardless of the structure, governing structure and so on. So we need to look at moral and ethical in the light of how it's consistent with fundamental human rights. Then we need to take an example of this and see how that works and whether or not it works in some sort of consistent manner that actually respects and advances human rights. And that's the point of democracy and capitalism. And then an example of one of the fundamentals of capitalism and democracy is Citizens United and free speech. And we'll see how that case is interpreted by the Supreme Court, because you've got two very different opinions. The majority says no, that corporations and the like should have a voice in political debate and the like. And then the dissenting opinion says this corrupts. This kind of money coming in corrupts. Now, okay, in the interest of full disclosure, my bias, and you should not buy into this because it's my bias, right? My bias is that money corrupts, that money controls information. By doing so, it can manipulate the choices people have and they understand, and they define things differently. So is it good for a particular event to happen or not? Should people take to the streets when they feel the government is not meeting their needs? And how should they take to the streets? Should they take to the streets in such a way that violates human rights, or how we define it? It becomes very, very complicated, especially when you put down the political structure. So let's look at democracy. Now, I don't want to get into, unfortunately, human rights encompasses so much because it's so fundamental, and so much in political science and economics we really build upon it. I mean, politics and economics are just opposite sides of the same coin. What I always like to say is that politics is where the rubber meets the road, which means it's where economics and history and sociology and anthropology and a whole host of other areas of study, they really come together because they inform political structures, and political structures then act and create a society that we all have to kind of deal with. So democracy, and again, I don't want to get into a complicated definition, just a basic definition so we understand what we're looking at. And I'll give you one, for democracy and capitalism, and we'll explore it. Democracy is the belief in freedom and equality between people. So far, so good. Right? It seems consistent with what we've, talked about with moral, what is moral and what is ethical. Or a system of government based on this belief. Now, that's where it gets dicey. It may be based on that belief, but the things that it does may, in fact, be contrary to it. Okay, in which power is either held by elected representatives or directly by the people themselves. So let's get something off the table. Yes, democracy does incorporate that last part, directly by the people themselves. It's not practical when the society has a great many people in it. When the idea, the concept was more or less, conjured up, if you will, the city-states were very small. And so you could have everyone directly involved, more or less. You can't do that. So it's representative government. But therein lies the problem. You're asking others who are supposed to provide you information to make decisions for you. And the idea that you can elect them means that you have some control over them. You don't like what they're doing, you can get them out. But if they're there for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, in the case of representatives, the president, and the Senate, respectively, if day one you're not happy with what they're doing, you've got to wait 2 years to get them out. Unless there's some sort of violation and you can remove them from office, which is what Congress would do. Representative government is great, but there's no guarantee that what they say, as we know, these politicians, they're going to do, that when they get in office, in fact, they do them, or in the way you believe they're going to do them. So you've already removed yourself for at least 2 years from having an influence on those politicians. Now, you could make the argument that they want to get reelected and keep their jobs. Fair enough. But they can still do a lot of damage in 2 years. Again, full disclosure, this idea of having term limits, I've always objected to, on the basis of, if they're going to do damage, they'll just do it quicker. If you put a thief, and I'm not saying politicians are thieves, although there's an argument that can be made. If you put them in the store for an hour, they'll just steal faster than if they're there for 2. In other words, you can do a lot of things that are bad in a short period of time, so there is an element here of trust. But representatives remove people from the immediacy of that process. And quite honestly, it makes sense because not everybody can stop their daily lives or know enough to make informed decisions. So we depend on these representatives to tell us what things are. And also intermediary sort of structures like political parties and the media, who's supposed to kind of keep us up to date or give us information about what's going on and then inform the political structures about what people think and want. When those intermediate structures don't do that, we've broken the link. And as you'll see, that gets very, very complicated. So this idea of democracy and elected representatives, the representatives that are responsible for thinking about that, the fundamental human rights involved in any policy, and then acting on it. The problem also is that even if the policy will do that, the execution of it could be such that it doesn't satisfy that goal, right? There's a whole host of things that can come wrong. And I always like to say that you can't legislate into the hearts and minds of people what is not there by nature or nurture. That you can't really get people by a mandate to change their thinking. You see that with people that are very much tied to a political party. Everyone that is in America a Republican or is a Democrat, we'll leave independents out of this because I think a very strong argument can be made for the fact that people really aren't independent. They're mostly Democratic or they're mostly Republican. Again, that can move around. But if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you can take the position that there's no errors being made by that party. Yet even if there's an error being made, the people that belong to that party typically will alter it. They're okay with the hypocrisy of it. This also makes it difficult for us to say that a democratic structure is really doing its job in terms of representative government, right? In other words, as soon as you introduce representation into it, you remove people by a step, and if those intermediary institutions aren't doing their job, you've moved people back even further. And people are committed to their parties, even in the face of evidence that they're not doing what they said or there's some sort of conflict. Politicians, as you know, are very comfortable on both sides of the aisle, even if they claim they're independent, right? They're okay with hypocrisy because you can always make an argument. Half-truths are much more dangerous than a lie because a half-truth has some measure of truth. It makes it hard to discern whether or not what's been stated is a lie or not. Politicians, again, love that. Now, I'm not going to go into political parties or structures or whatever, but you have to understand that representatives are in this in many, many, many ways. All right, so that's democracy. So the issue is representation there, right? And how it works out these moral imperatives and the like. Now, what about capitalism? Capitalism is an economic, political, and social system in which property, business, and industry are privately owned. Now, that seems consistent with democracy, right? Held by elected representatives, directly by the people, and that democracy talks about freedom and equality. That freedom would indicate that people could pursue their own economic interests, right? And it says social system in which property, business, and industry are privately owned. We can make many arguments for why that makes the most sense and why that's really important to have in place. And I think that it does. But here's the problem. Directed toward making the greatest possible profits for successful organizations and people. Therein lies, there's the rub, right? Greatest possible profits. Okay, at what expense? If that's their only goal, that they have to increase their and by the way, that's I don't want to get into the history of it too much. I keep saying I don't want to get into things, but human rights least really everywhere, so I want to just kind of focus it. Harvard Business School in the case model really eventually had to come up with a founding principle, and that's it. That this is the goal of the system, that it's supposed to greatest possible profits because, for successful organizations in measure, because that's easy to track. That's easy to intellectually and scholarly explore. That's the goal. Are they doing it or not? Why aren't they doing it? What could they have done to succeed at it? That the greatest profit is what we're really after. The problem is, at what expense? Does seeking the greatest profit mean that someone makes so much money that deprives others of making a fair living? Right? And what is a fair living? So the idea of democracy, this freedom, and capitalism seem to be a bit at odds with each other. especially as they are directed towards the fundamentals of human rights, fundamental human rights, basic human rights, which we'll explore, and then we'll come back up and we'll tie it all together. So if you think about the idea here, is if you're free, at what point does your freedom infringe on the freedoms of others, right? In other words, your rights have to end where the rights of others begin. Take an extreme case. If I manage to capture all the resources and all the wealth of the country, what happens? There are a couple of many actually great books, and that explore this idea. Some authors like Stiglitz have written several, and others. They're fascinating in terms of understanding the interconnection between things, but at their core, you have to think how these businesses maximize those profits. You only maximize profits when you do a lot of business, right? And that the business you do has the greatest possible, markup. In other words, the profit is great. We're not going to get into monopoly profits, but keep in mind that if you capture a market, you're the only player there. What's going to happen is that as you control that whole market, you're going to want to give people lesser quality product and charge them more for it, because that will maximize profits. Think about eyeglasses. And I haven't kept up with the industry, but there was a time, it may still be the case, where really one company controlled the cost of frames, plastic frames. Plastic is really cheap, but go buy, for those that wear glasses, go try and buy a pair of glasses, from one of these retailers, which are also owned by this one company that really controls the eyeglass market, the frames. It's plastic, $300-$400 for a pair of plastic, frames. And then what about the actual glasses? They're not glass, right? They're usually plastic. So the markup is tremendous. So the profits are great. But that means someone that needs the glasses is paying more for them. And since one company controls so much of it, no one can compete against them because they can just keep lowering their price. They have such a big profit margin. They can keep lowering their price while making less profit, but they can drive others out of the market because there's not massive profits anymore, right? I like to give the example of Microsoft. Microsoft and Bill Gates are heralded as a great model for the idea of capitalism. But here you've got a case where the history is, Microsoft was working for IBM. And at this point, going way back into the dark ages, IBM had people that, these computer, I don't want to say anything disparagingly, but computer nerds, people that were just into computers, and they wanted a computer, of their own to sort of work on. So, IBM said, look, we do mainframes, we do big stuff here, but we do want to satisfy this market because, it's a market, we'll do it. It may grow. And so the personal computer came along. But they went to small computers, right? Microsoft software for small computers. And they said, can you write an operating system for something like this? Microsoft said, like any good business, not a problem, absolutely. Whether or not they really understood how to do it or not. You're in a business, you sort of tell a client you can do it and you make sure you can do it at some point. And they went to someone who they knew could do it and they said, could you do this thing? And the guy said, I can't waste my time writing code for some operating system. And the guy does, and I forget the amount he sells it to Microsoft for eventually. But Microsoft goes to, IBM says, here it is. IBM sends it out. It doesn't work so well, right? In fact, DOS was the original system, dirty operating system. It's just like, here, take it. Had a lot of bugs in it. So IBM comes back to Microsoft and says, guys, we're getting complaints, it's buggy, can you fix it? They go back to the guy who wrote the code. And my history here is a little sloppy, so you have to understand that. Not sloppy enough to change the outcome. And the guy says, I haven't got time for this. Microsoft says, all right, we'll buy it from you, the operating system. The guy says, great, here it is. I think the price was $1,000. So they sell it to him. And time again, Microsoft gets it wrong. And it keeps coming back. IBM at one point says, we'll just take it from you, we'll fix it. And Microsoft, Bill Gates, it's on the business end, said, no, we'll do it. And they realized that this market was growing. But operating systems, and by the way, what they used to do, since these guys were computer folks and really loved messing with code, they would send out the operating system to these guys first. They would do the beta testing, and they'd say, let us know what's buggy about it, and we'll fix it. And these guys loved that. Send it back, and and then Microsoft would send it out into the marketplace, and it'd be buggy still, and they'd come back, and version after version after version of DOS. And so it got better, but it was never known as any great operating system. We're not going to go into Apple. That fact helped Apple. So what eventually happens there is Microsoft realized there's a big market out there in other things like word processing and spreadsheets. The average person, loves to do their bills, and some sort of spreadsheet would help. They like to write letters and stuff to each other. So it makes sense to give them an operating system that also has on it, some sort of spreadsheet and some sort of word processing package. And since you're buying the operating system, we're not going to charge you for the spreadsheet and the word processing package. We're going to give it to you for free. Now think about that. The operating system has to come from Microsoft, and you're getting two important programs for free. So WordPerfect had a big share of that market in the word processing, and Lotus 123 had a big market in the spreadsheets. When Microsoft gave it away for nothing, big profit margins, right? Code doesn't cost anything. You send it out, it's there. So there's a high markup on it. It really drives these other two companies out of business. And before the court, public opinion, and also before Congress, Bill Gates has to answer for this. And his answer was, we're not trying to eat into that market. We just think it would be a nice thing, someone to write a letter or do their bills on. It's just a small little thing. He knew it wouldn't be. And then every once in a while, he'd write an operating system that wouldn't work with the previous packages. So he had to buy those packages now. And once he captured that market, the price for the packages went way up. And the quality of it didn't justify the improvement in the quality, didn't justify it. That's capitalism. Today, you can see what capitalism allows in terms of this idea of freedom for some, Amazon, Jeff Bezos. I mean, think about that. How much of different products, that one company and that one man who just bought the Washington Post, a revered newspaper. Is that being corrupted? That's another argument, of course. But nevertheless, this kind of power, this kind of money really influences information and decision making and that sort of thing. So, capitalism seems to take this idea of freedom and begin to eat away at it. And so when does it eat away too much? Now, to go back to the concept of, these markets, people have to buy stuff. How can people buy stuff if they don't have money to buy? So there's a natural mechanism in here. It gets to the point where the people are so impoverished, that you have nothing to lose but to rise up. So there's a balance. There's a point at which the elites and these major corporations have to allow people to be able to have the money in order to buy their products and services, or they can't make more. You can't sell to yourself. Herein lies the problem. And this is something that's not really looked at when we talk about human rights. Population growth. Fundamental right is to procreate. But what happens if the procreation outpaces opportunities in the marketplace to make money? In other words, jobs. And companies want to maximize their profits, so why hire people? People are a problem. Now they go on strike if they're the union. They want raises. They get sick. They need vacation time. They only can work so many hours a day. If you can get capital to do that, which is machinery and the like, they don't get tired. They don't go on strike. They don't need vacation. They work constantly. And if the technology makes it quicker and easier, where you can have one person that does 8 jobs but still get paid like they were doing one, you increase your profits. Problem with capitalism. Now, as the population grows, technology moves, wants profits for these companies. Those companies see profits in other means of production besides people. The sustenance of people get eaten out. And as a consequence of that, we're on a path to some sort of conflict. You can't tell people not to procreate. And the more and more children they have, the more and more workers are being produced in a structure that needs less workers. Now what do you do? That's the problem. Now what happens? So it's a very practical matter. I don't think anyone would step forward and say, we've got to limit the number of children people can have. Not by legislation. We can try to get information out there that says to do this. But there is an interest now in maximizing population. A lot of people with less money in the aggregate can buy something if you make it cheap enough and you can keep them buying it. Planned obsolescence. Good example of that was at one time to buy a printer. The printer was incredibly expensive and the ink was cheap. And then HP and others realized, give people the printers. Make them buy expensive ink. So ink, which is just water and dye, all of a sudden it costs, $80, $90, $100, $200 for a cartridge of ink. And it runs out. You got to buy more. And if the printer can do, 150,000 copies, I don't know actually what that number is, but it's a lot, and you need 3 or 4 cartridges, you got the printer for nothing. It's planned obsolescence. So they're actually buying something that's cheap and they're making a lot of money on it. But the more people you get that can do that, you can make more money in profits by having more people, so greater population, buying something that's less expensive across the board. Problem is, at some point you want to move up your profit margin, and technology will only move that so fast, although it moves fast right now, and can only produce that much more profit, right? Remember something, the thing about capitalism and democracy is people seek their own economic benefit, right? Step back for a second and look at the military-industrial complex. What is their job? Their job, right, is to basically go to war if needed and protect the country. What if there are no wars? What if there's no need to protect the country? What do? Think about the people that produce the armaments, right? And there are a few companies that do. The planes and the tanks. Well, commercial airlines don't use, bombers to take people anywhere. And the average person doesn't go out and buy a tank. So these companies produce, military hardware for the military. If the military doesn't use it, if there's no conflict, then what's the rationale for spending more tax dollars buying more tanks? And then when tanks become obsolete, you spend more money buying something else. And then you buy unmanned, right, aircraft, drones and the like. We don't even need a pilot. Again, the human factor goes down, right? Seeking their own benefit economically creates a democratic conflict. Are you really free now? Do you have opportunity? Is it fair? Is it right? Is it just? Right? Does it run with the idea of fundamental human rights or not? So capitalism and democracy, while they seem to advocate the greatest advancement for human rights and the fundamentals of that, and there's limitations you'll see in terms of governing structures. Human rights should be fundamental regardless of governing structures. But these things seem to be at loggerheads. They don't seem to be supportive of each other. As you seek your own economic capitalist ends, you're going to distort the democratic process. And as more and more people, the planet grows in population, it's not only a strain on resources, but it's also the capacity to find work. Right? Think of it this way. Fundamental rights. Every human being has a right to sustain themselves. And this is controversial, right? What I'm about to say, I think, offends some people. But you need to think about this. When the population grows quickly in any industry, more people are working there. The fundamentals of economics say, well, the wage rate comes down. Supply of workers, right? The more workers there are, the wage rate comes down because there are more people competing for a job, so you can actually pay less. Oh, you don't want to take this job for $30,000 a year? We got a guy that'll take it for $28,000. You want the job or don't you? Right? And so most people would say, give me the job. They want to work. So the more workers in the marketplace, the wage rate goes down. This is fundamental to economics, right? Supply and demand. Supply of workers goes up, right? The demand for these people that are hiring, right, remains constant. You can go ahead and pay them less. So now think about something that we really all supported and still support fundamentally, right? That women in the workplace, right, is essential, right? They belong they belong having the same opportunities, I always say, as everybody else. But it definitely increases the number of workers. If that's true, that means wage rates should go down. And if you look at the economics of this and the numbers, what's happened is you now need two members of the family, say mom and dad or two partners, that have to go out and work. And yet the money they bring in is, as of about 3-4 years ago, was not the same as, say, their grandparents brought in. In other words, buying that basket of goods is not possible with two incomes today, whereas one person working was able to buy that basket of goods. It's how we know whether or not people's earnings have gone up. We say, here's a basket of normal goods. People buy these things, we put them into a basket, and could one person buy that on their salary? And the answer is yes, going back. Now we look at two people working, right, for one family or one grouping, and they can't make enough to buy that same basket, which means you've now got two people working to buy less. Supply of workers. I mean, it would make more sense in the open market, and this is impractical for obviously, human rights issues and others, but for every coupling to get together, right, with their domestic partner or their spouse, whatever it may be, and say, which one of us is capable of making more money? You go to work, I'll stay home. And if everyone did that, then there'd be less workers and the wage rate would go up. Of course, there would be cheating, which would be, the wage rate's gone up. Let me also jump into the workforce with you. And so people are trying to maximize their own well-being. So it's a natural tendency for people to want to go into the workforce. But that tendency, as we seek our own economic benefit, runs contrary to our hope of maximizing sort of our own profit. If you got 30 companies all making pencils, the price of a pencil is going to go down. The supply there is great. And if the demand remains constant, then the cost goes down, the profits go down, and companies don't want to make pencils anymore. Microsoft made its money. Rockefeller made his money. Bezos is making their money by capturing markets. You capture a market, monopoly profits, lower quality product at a higher expense. So democracy and capitalism have this sort of conflict going, which really you see kind of come sort of the underlying drive behind the Citizens United case. And I just want to read you, excuse me for a second here, I just want to read you a couple of things from that case and the decision. This is from, and here we've got is the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission in 2010. You can go read the case in a case book, constitutional case book. But the argument here is whether or not, in the fundamentals, is whether corporations, which aren't people, should be allowed to spend money supporting campaigns and the like. So here's a piece from the majority decision. Speech is an essential mechanism of democracy. No one denies that, right? For it's the means to hold officials accountable to people. We've already talked about the problem with that. The right of citizens to inquire, to hear, to speak, and to use information to reach consensus is a precondition to enlighten self-government and a necessary means to protect it. The First Amendment, quote, has its fullest and most urgent application to speech uttered during a campaign for political office. That's where it's most important to have freedom of speech. For obvious reasons, you're electing representatives and you want to let them know what you think and so on. For these reasons, political speech must prevail against laws that would suppress it, whether by design or inadvertence. Laws that burden political speech are subject to strict scrutiny. That's the standard, and here it is, which requires the government to prove that restriction furthers a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. That the government's restriction furthers a compelling government interest or interest of the people and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. Right? So basically, hey, everyone has a right to speak. Of course, as you'll see, the problem here is that money in elections, if you believe it doesn't matter, in terms of corrupting the process, you're fine. As I said, it obviously does. So that money influences the message, because these candidates need the money. It influences legislation. These candidates, once elected, actually proffer up and the like. And that means there's limited decision making. In other words, people depend upon these political parties and others to sort of represent them. But, these parties are cue givers. It's like, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. The Republicans or the Democrats say this, so I support that. And they sort of, may have to defend that position, and it may be a difficult position to defend. On the other side, that's Scalia. On the other side, you've got Stevens and others saying this. Indeed, to exclude or impede corporate speech is to muzzle the principle. I'm sorry, this is still Scalia. Indeed, to exclude or impede corporate speech is to muzzle the principal agents of the modern free economy. They're tying the two together, as we've just done. We should celebrate rather than condemn the addition of this speech to the public debate, corporate speech. Justice Stevens, and who I think here, again, full disclosure, has got this right. The court ruling threatens to undermine the integrity of elected institutions across the nation. The path it has taken to reach its outcome will, I fear, do damage to this institution. Allowing corporations to sort of have this say is actually going to be problematic. Again, I would argue that Stevens is on the money. All this money coming in, and we make politicians in order to run for office and win need that money. It's natural for the politicians wanting to keep their jobs and their access to power that they're going to distort their policy decisions to maximize the benefit of these companies. Look at Google and others, and you can see how that might come into play. I don't want to get into whether Google's corrupt or not corrupt, but that's how it functions. So in Citizens United, what happened with that case, it just stepped up the amount of money going to elections and brought some big players to the table, whereas before it was illegal for them to do it, now it was okay. And it makes perfect sense that as people seek their own maximized profit, whether it's in power as a currency or dollars or both, that they want to win that election. And if you need money to advertise, then you're going to go to those sources that can give you the most, and you're going to advocate for them, right? The fact that two previous speakers of the House, now advocate for and represent China, who's a major rival by all measures, tells you how that process really works. So with Citizens United, we had a major corruption of the process, and I believe it's the worst decision. I don't want to overstate the case in terms of the economic and democratic interplay. That becomes really problematic. Okay, so now the door we've walked into here is one where we have to look at all this stuff is built on this concept of these fundamental human rights, right? Again, the morality of it and the like. So what we're looking at here now is exactly, what we can say about what fundamental human rights really are. I'm going to read from you several things, and you're going to see the unifying principle here is that these idea of human rights as moral guarantees are not subject to governmental structures or momentary interpretations of what things really mean, actions mean. So I'm going to read and explain these concepts. So we start with the side that human rights are certain moral guarantees, right? That basically to assess this contemporary significance of human rights, that the doctrine of human rights has become the dominant moral doctrine for evaluating moral status and of the contemporary geopolitical order. Okay. Now, if you're going to chart this historical development of the concept of human rights, beginning with discussions of the earliest philosophical origins of the philosophical basis of human rights, and culminating in some of the most recent developments in the codification of human rights, you have to look at that. I'm just giving you the bullets here, and then we'll explore it. The philosophical concept of human rights and analysis, the formal and substantive distinctions philosophers have drawn between various forms and categories of rights, has to also be explored. And then the question of how philosophers have sought to justify the claims of human rights, and specifically charts the arguments presented by the two presently dominant approaches in the field, which is interest theory, okay, and will theory. And then finally, you have to look at the discussion of the main criticisms that currently exist that are leveled at the doctrine of human rights and highlight some of the main arguments of those who challenge it. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look at this idea and of the historical origins and the development of the theory and practice of human rights, right? So the doctrine of human rights rests upon a particularly fundamental philosophical claim, and here it is, that there exists a rationally identifiable moral order. Now, rational. Things that are rational indicate there's a capacity for people collectively to reason from a set of known facts to a conclusion about how those facts interact and what they might produce in terms of some sort of outcome. So when we say a fundamental philosophical claim, there's this rational, identifiable moral order, an order whose legitimacy, here we go, precedes contingent social and historical conditions and applies to all human beings everywhere at all times. You'll see this over and over again. That it's not tied to the moment in time, and it's not tied to the structures human beings come up with for governance. Moral beliefs and concepts are capable of being objectively validated as fundamentally and universally true. That's the key here. That's the basis. Fundamental human rights is not subject to a moment in time. It's not subject to a political structure. It is of itself self-contained. All right, we talked about natural law the previous lecture. Think about how that ties in here. Human rights rests upon moral universalism and the belief in the existence of a truly universal moral community comprising all human beings. Again, rests upon moral universalism, that morality is the same, right, everywhere. Moral universalism posits the existence of a rationally identifiable, there is again, transcultural and transhistorical moral truths. Transcultural means the culture and the historical moment, right? And the structures of governance should not influence what is a human right, and what is not. Okay? And it's the origins of moral universalism within Europe are typically associated with the writings of Aristotle and the Stoics. We're not going to really go into that in any great detail here. The basis of the doctrine of natural law is the belief in the existence of a natural moral code based upon the identification of certain fundamental and objectively verifiable human goods. Okay, this idea of human goods, what are all human beings sort of entitled to, right? Our enjoyment of these basic goods is to be secured by our possession of equally fundamental and objectively verifiable natural rights. There it is. Natural law was deemed to pre-exist actual social and political systems. Natural law is a fundamental law that governs what we all have, and that's the place we first look for human rights. We talked about this last time. Natural rights were thereby similarly presented as rights individuals possessed independently of society or polity. Natural rights were thereby presented as ultimately valid irrespective of whether they had achieved the recognition of any given political ruler or assembly. They exist. We don't care that the king ignores them, that the dictator ignores them. They exist. They exist fundamentally and of their own weight. You don't need a society to support it. The quintessential exponent of this position was the 17th century philosopher John Locke, and in particular the argument he outlined in the his two treatises of government. At the center of Locke's argument is the claim that individuals possess natural rights independently of the political recognition granted them by the state. These natural rights are possessed independently of and prior to the formation of any political community. It has to be built upon these ideas. Locke argued that natural rights flowed from natural law. In his two treatises of government, the Declaration of Independence of the United States is making this point, right? Locke's life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was fundamental, and Jefferson, if you lifted a lot from Locke, life, liberty, and the right to happiness. I mean that what is happiness? But there it is. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, and you should, you'll notice that the first thing that Jefferson establishes is that there is this natural right, that people have a right to be free and all this, and it's not given to them by some government structure, and that when they're not free, they have a right to seek their own freedom. Locke provided the precedent of establishing legitimate political authority upon a rights foundation. The thing about Locke is that by structuring it this way, you can't build a society unless you build it, right, upon this bedrock foundation of human rights. And this is an undeniable essential component of human rights, right? However, the philosophical adequate completion of theoretical basis of human rights requires an account of moral reasoning. We're back up top. What is good? Because if it's a fundamental right, it would have to, by definition, be good, right? A fundamental right that is corrosive or hurts someone, why would anyone embrace that, right? Moral reasoning that is both consistent with the concept of those rights, but which does not necessarily require an appeal to authority, a government, of some superhuman entity. And there they're talking about God, and we're not going to go into that, but that's where it begins, in justifying human beings' claims to certain fundamental rights. These fundamental rights don't depend on anything else. They create the good. They define the good. They're universal. They're not driven by culture. They're not determined by culture, I should say. They're not determined by governance. They're not determined by anything else. They're fundamental rights which we all have. We don't need anyone to give them to us. We don't need any government to provide them for us. They are there. We have them, and it can't be taken or disrupted in any way. All right. So what about morality or moral versus legal rights now? The distinction drawn between moral rights and legal rights are two separate categories of rights is of fundamental importance to understand the basis and potential application of human rights. Again, legal rights are designed by bodies of governing bodies consistent with the culture and the accepted ideas of what's good and what's not. Here, so legal rights are not moral rights, not necessarily. They can be consistent with it, but they're structured legal rights by a culture-driven set of political institutions, right? Okay. What I want to do is I want to now try and bring all of this together in some sort of way in which you can get your mind around how this all interrelates. Human rights depend on nothing. They are fundamentally essential, right? They drive and structure what human beings fundamentally need in order to be fully human, right? To experience what human beings are permitted by their very nature, natural to actually experience, like procreation. That doesn't mean the outcome is going to necessarily be what we want in terms of some sort of definition of what's good. So you start there with the fundamental human rights, and what gets built upon that, because it's separate from other human structures like political structures and historical moments in time, but it leads from there to this moral, right, and this ethical sort of behavior that's consistent with those fundamental human rights. That is, whatever gets created in terms of how the society defines its morality and its ethical, behavior, should advance these fundamental human rights. They should not run contrary to them, because you can't violate that fundamental law. The rule of law, which is the structure designed by human beings, must also embrace those. Unfortunately, human rights, as we define it, gets a bit dicey, because human rights refers to those things which are fundamentally good for the human experience. We're still stuck defining good. That's why it's so important to look at the fundamental underpinnings of those, human rights, those particular elements of human rights. So the problem is that securing those human rights is going to fall particularly on those governmental structures and non-organized governmental structures. We're getting into murky water. We start off with something pure, and then as we try and execute it through our political structures in our historical moment in time, it gets weird. And it could seem like it stands, or the actions are completely contrary to what the fundamental rights that all human beings have. You have to remember one thing that's important here. you need to know where the line is, where someone can exercise their rights. They have to end where the rights of others begin. The moment in time we're in right now in 2020 is such that this is very clear, right? The discussion about what is appropriate expression and what is not appropriate expression, because it limits the freedoms of others, needs to be delineated and needs to be protected in some measure. But the question is, what kinds of actions cross that divide, where they do affect someone else's rights? I mean, the government has to make decisions. And once the human right, the moral and ethical, manifestation built upon the interpretation of those fundamental human rights, once that's been corrupted, human rights which remain, they don't change, but the moral and ethical structures do. That needs to be corrected, right? The question is, how do you correct it? And when there's political interest and political gain in supporting a particular event, whether it's Citizens United or some particular cultural or political movement, politicians want to keep their jobs, may in fact follow that. And actually, in pursuing their own ends, it runs contrary to the public good and starts violating this concept of human rights. And on we go. We're going to go into more of this in the next lecture. We're going to explore a bit more of this. But this is an article, Human Rights, which comes out of the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You don't really need to go to much more than this to get a fundamental idea of the structures we're talking about. So if you read that, in total it's 26 pages, you'll find that you have a very good grounding in all this. So again, fundamental human rights, we build upon that, right? The moral and ethical, structures and actions, and that those fundamental human rights are not subject to the culture, the moment in time, the political structures. They are universal truths. And the reason why they're universal is because without those rights, right, we are diminished in our ability to experience our lives, which we have a right to do. The problem when you look at capitalism and democracy is they seem to work in strange ways together that seem to bastardize that concept a bit. Whereas we're great advocates of democracy and capitalism, and I would make make the argument that you'd be hard pressed to find historically other structures that seem to come as close to this support of human rights, besides a democratic capitalist structure, but they're also corruptive. And as they get corrupted with money, as people pursue their own ends, that line about where freedoms begin and end gets blurred. And the Supreme Court decision, in Citizens United, seems to say this is okay. It doesn't really corrupt the process because the fundamental concept is, that the more free speech, the better. But what that means is you've got to figure out where that line is. And that line is difficult to figure out. And so consequently, there is a corruption. So that's our challenge with human rights. To get to what they are, define them. They're universal. That must be part of their nature. They do not deviate over culture, time, or political structure. And then does the political structure, forced by the historical moment and the cultural imperatives, and the way in which they enacted their legislation, does that support those or not? And there's another element. How do we know when they stop supporting it? It depends upon whose ox is being gored. If I'm benefiting from it, it's okay. And if I'm not benefiting from it, it's not okay. As people seek their own ends, they willingly corrupt that process. More importantly, they are willing to let representatives make those decisions for them and sell them that bill of goods. Democrat, Republican, Independent. Control the information. People begin to accept that information. They will interpret everything in that particular, through that particular lens and justify it. And then you get division between parties. So I'll leave you with this idea. In America, one of the fundamental questions I think that have to be answered is, are we talking about differences in class that are the real problem. And again, full disclosure, I believe it is. I don't believe it's race. That is something that we've obviously and rightfully been concerned with, and we've tried to move and improve, and we still need to do. But behind that, is there a class struggle? Is it more important to look at the differences in class than it is to look at the differences in, say, race or gender or the like? Now, I haven't got an answer for that. My suspicion, and I think it's well-founded, is that it's class. Because class reinforces all of that, right? Giving poor neighborhoods, regardless of the race, not enough resources to educate really hurts. It has a real major impact. And so, you have to ask yourself, what do we do with that? So I'll leave you with this idea. Go look up the Robin Hood Foundation. It was started by a guy named Paul Theta Jones. And look how he structured that. And look what the goal is. And ask yourself, does this advance, is this billionaire advancing this idea of equality by accepting it's about class, and what you need to do to correct that is you need to advance education. It's a long process, and politicians are short-run beasts. Representatives, 2 years. Before they have to run for re-election. They spend one of those 2 years just trying to get money in. So look at that, the Robin Hood Foundation. And I leave you now, I keep saying it, but I'll leave you with this thought. When you're looking for a more equitable society, if you focus on the long run, you're much better off. But people are short-run beasts. They see 60, 70, 80 years of life, and they see it through those blinders. And that's their reality. Most people don't want to expand that view. It's hard. You want to accept your truths. Got that over with, I can just go on. So I would make this argument. And I don't believe this is an argument that many make. I could be wrong. I've not done a poll or whatever. I would advocate extending those offices, not term limiting them. And so I would like to see representatives in our democratic structure not get 2 years, but 6. I'd like to see senators, moved up to maybe 8 years per term, and the president get rid of the limitation on the number of terms they can run for. Because that makes the last 2 years of any president, regardless if it's Democrat or Republican, sort of, you're just dead in the water. They can just Congress can just resist you, and so really it's just a 6-year term. But once you relieve that, remove that limitation, you might find that more people are willing to go into politics that have an interest in maybe advancing the cause. Sure, they can steal, they can still do all of that, but here's something else. If you only have to run once every 6 years, you only need money once every 6 years. So yes, you might need more money, and you might spend time trying to get more money, but you're not looking for money all the time. Again, in the House of Representatives, they're looking for it half the time. Okay? And most people that have money give it to both sides. They don't advocate for one or the other. They give it to both. You don't want to do it my bidding for me? Next time, I give my money to the other party, to your challenger. I'm giving money to everybody, so whoever wins, I win. That's a corruption of the process, but it doesn't change the fundamental rights that exist that we have to adhere to, and that action violates. All right, that's the end of the second lecture. We'll pick it up next time.